You're listening to a CNA podcast.
Muslims in two Southeast Asian countries with the largest Islamic populations appear to be moving in different directions. Malaysia is experiencing a rise in religious conservatism, while the result of Indonesia's recent presidential election suggests this conservatism and identity politics in the country are on the wane. More than 60% of Malaysia's 34 million or so population is Muslim, while the number for Indonesia's 270 million population is higher at around 87%. So what makes them so different? And what do the trends mean for Muslims and non-Muslims in these nations? You're listening to CNA Correspondent, a podcast usually hosted by Teresa Tang, who is away this week. I'm Arnold Gay. On the show today are CNA's Neville Rader and Amir Yusof, who are behind a 5-part series on political Islam. Neville and Amir, thank you so much for joining us on the show today.
Hi.
Thank you, Arnold.
Thank you.
Neville, maybe I can start with you. Can you describe what political Islam is exactly?
Well, the use of religion to advance certain political agenda or gain has been around across the globe for millennia. And you can say that is a form of identity politics. And in the case of Indonesia and Malaysia, that identity is Islam, which is embraced by the majority of people in both countries. Indonesia, for example, is a secular country, but there are people who feel that Islam and the state should not be separated and that Indonesia should be based under Sharia law. In Malaysia, you have different ethnic groups and different religions, but there are those who feel that Islamic law should be applied to everyone. And the influence of these people is steadily growing. And what has been happening in that some political parties and bureaucrats try to accommodate the demands of these Islamic groups and figures in order to maintain power or obtain certain political gains.
Okay, understood. So it's been around, but lately, though, both of you have noticed some changes in the countries that you cover where you're based, respectively, Malaysia and Indonesia. Amir, what have you noticed specifically for Malaysia?
Well, in Malaysia, we have seen what many observers are termed as the green wave, a growing conservatism that has swept through many parts of the country, especially in the rural Malay heartland. This is evident in how the conservative Islamist party, Parti Islam Se-Malaysia, or PAS, is now the party with the most seats in parliament. And beyond that, he has also made inroads in urban areas in Selangor during the last state elections in 2023. And playing up religious sentiments to strengthen their Malay Muslim base is a policy that the party is engaged and is urging things like banning of concerts, ban gambling, and pushing through Sharia laws. And all these move the country away from the concept of a Malaysian Malaysia, a country for all races.
And Neville, your observations for Indonesia?
It's slightly different in Indonesia. Over the last 2 decades, there have been numerous provinces, regencies, and cities which have enacted Sharia-inspired regulations, while there is no significant shift in the power balance between the nationalist parties and the Islamist parties. But I would like to talk about this Sharia regulation. These regulations, funnily enough, some of them were enacted by politicians and bureaucrats who came originally from nationalist party or those who were backed by nationalist parties. And there are regulations which, for example, mandate female students to wear the hijab at school. There are regulations which require female public workers to wear the hijab to work. All sorts of the regulations inspired by the Islamic law, Sharia. And these regulations do not explicitly say that those who are not Muslims will be exempted from the requirement. So cases of discrimination are rampant. Women's rights, freedom of expression, and civil liberties are infringed, basically.
All right, I want to ask the both of you how this rise in religious conservatism can be explained. Amir, what's the explanation? Is there one for what's happening in Malaysia?
Well, Arnold, I think there are two possible reasons. Firstly is that how PAS, the Conservative Party, has been quite effective in its social media campaign. and how Muslim youths are gravitating more towards religious content rather than consuming music or movies. This is one reason. The other reason is that in Malaysia, UMNO, traditionally the strongest party that has been dominant since its independence, has shifted. The support for UMNO has lessened over the years due to corruption scandals involving its leaders like Najib Razak, like Ahmad Zahid Hamidi. And so it is no longer the dominant party it once was. So the Malay Muslims in Malaysia, they look to the next best alternative party that champions the rights of Malays in Islam, and that is PAS. So it's also a combination of other factors as well. There is dissatisfaction with the current government led by Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim. Things like cost of living, Malaysian ringgit, depreciation. And so people are gravitating towards the opposition, and PAS uses religious sentiments as a tool to stir up emotion.
All right, Neville, if you'll bear with me, I just want to ask a follow-up question to Amir. Amir, in the news lately was this whole controversy involving KK Mart, and there was a shoemaker that was involved as well. Can you remind us what Muslims were so angry about?
So the issue here is on the sale of socks by KK Mart bearing the name of Allah at some of its outlets. So Allah is a term used by Muslims to refer to God. It's a very sacred term. Muslims hold God as the highest regard, and putting it on a garment on one's feet is a sign of disrespect in the eyes of Malaysian Muslims. So the photos of these socks went viral online, sparking outrage, calls for boycott of the convenience store chain. The founder, Mr. Chai Kichan, has apologized during a press conference, but this hasn't stopped the dissatisfaction. Certain parties like UMNO Youth Chief, Dr. Amal Saleh, has continued calls for boycott, and this has escalated to the point that there have been petrol bombs thrown into some of the outlets.
Can you explain why he did what he did, the UMNO Party Youth Chief?
So Dr. Amal has been the most vocal person on this issue. He's called for boycott. He's organized protests against the convenience store chain. But this is a classic example of a politician leveraging on religious and racial sentiment to gain political capital. Before this incident, no one knew who Dr. Amal Saleh was. But, if you're stoking religious sentiments, making statements like, if my religion is insulted, I'd rather die. He's playing to the gallery. Some Malaysians fall for it. And the right thing to do is actually to raise the issue and move on. The king, Sultan Ibrahim Sultan Iskandar, is aware of how this could potentially hurt racial religious sentiments in the country. So he has stepped in and met both Dr. Akmal and the Supermart founder, Mr. Chai. But I think it's not the end of the story. Religious relations continue to be tense in Malaysia, and any incident or issue can easily spark discontent across the different races.
Neville, in contrast, the situation in Indonesia seems to be slightly different. We had the absence, if you like, of identity politics in the recent presidential elections. Can you tell us, what was in play? Was it because of who Prabowo and Gibran are, what they represent, or are there factors that go beyond them?
Well, first of all, there were 3 presidential candidates. So the election was not as polarizing as in 2019 when there were only 2 candidates. This year, Islamist groups, Islamic political parties were essentially split into smaller factions and camps, each supporting different candidates. Whereas in 2019, the majority of the Islamic groups and political parties were behind Prabowo, who at the time was a government opposition figure. So in 2019 was essentially a battle between the nationalist camp and the Islamic camp. Another factor is that there has been a lot of pushback by the Indonesian authorities against some of the more radical, hardline Islamic groups like the Islamic Defenders Front, which were once very prominent and very influential. The ban can be considered a bit of a win for religious harmony and advocacy groups, although the timing of the ban can be considered, quite political, because it was just a few years before the election. But these hardline groups have been responsible for spreading hate and intolerant messages towards religious minorities. So some people consider it as a win.
Okay, so it's calmed down a bit, but I just want to go back to the point you were making at the start of our conversation, Neville. Has it completely died down, completely disappeared from Indonesia, life in Indonesia?
This sentiment has been around even before Indonesia became independent. In fact, it was one of the sticking points when Indonesia became independent in 1945. Should we become a secular state or should we become an Islamic nation? So I don't think this sentiment has really disappeared. And frankly, I don't think it will ever go away. Under the late President Suharto, who ruled Indonesia for 3 decades, these people were closely monitored and their messages were basically curbed. So when Suharto stepped down, almost overnight, Indonesia started to see the emergence of these hardline Islamist groups, including those who push for the adoption of the Islamic law, Sharia. I recently interviewed Andreas Harsono, the Indonesia researcher of Human Rights Watch, on this particular issue, and here's what he has to say.
The introduction of Sharia-inspired regulation began after the fall of President Suharto. Suharto stepped down in 1998. Soon the parliament discussed about a law to decentralize power in Indonesia. Thus, by 2001, it began the introduction of the Sharia-inspired regulation in West Sumatra. That was the first one. West Sumatra, and then 2002, Aceh, and spreading. By 2023, Indonesia has more than 700 Sharia-inspired regulation. They affect not only women's rights, but human rights in general. It is related to the decline of democracy, civil liberties, and many other rights in those Muslim majority areas.
Yeah, as Mr. Andreas said, I don't think it has really disappeared. And frankly, I don't think it will ever go away completely in Indonesia.
Okay, thank you. So we've touched on the role of politics and politicians. I want to ask you about the role of, preachers now. They are these days very active on social media in particular. Amir, how influential have they been in Malaysia?
In Malaysia, religious preachers or Islamic preachers have been very influential. You're talking about preachers with more than 1 million, 2 million followers on TikTok and Instagram. People listen to what they have to say, and political parties recognize this. They fund them and support these preachers, and they have grown to become more influential. One example that we met in Terengganu is Ustaz Azhar Idrus. He lives in a kampong house and drives a small car, fairly humble. But he's one of the most influential people in Malaysia, and he has crossed swords with the Prime Minister over controversial issues around religion. And this can make a difference in the polls, and parties like PAS recognizes this.
And Neville, the situation, do you have similar influence from preachers and imams there as well?
Well, it's a very similar situation here in Indonesia. These people are very influential. There are a number of preachers who had millions and millions of followers, loyal followers, you could say, on social media. And they are so influential not just on issues related to religion, but also politics. The election in February, for example, saw several preachers throwing their support for Prabowo, and thus Prabowo was able to secure a landslide win over his two rivals. And I think because they are not career politicians or directly affiliated to any political party, the endorsement of these preachers in the eyes of many Indonesians can be felt much more impartial and genuine.
So Neville and Amir, this is a bit of a chicken and egg question I have for the both of you. Are these preachers and religious, figures responding to a tilt in society, or is society responding to them with their messages on social media and at the mosques and other places? Neville, perhaps I start with you again.
I think it's the politician who, by nature, will gravitate to whoever can swing the most votes in their favor. And really, the best way to do that is by wooing the support of a political party, a civic organization, prominent individuals, and not just preachers, but also celebrity influencers as well. But I have to say, preachers has the added benefit of boosting candidates' religious credential, if you will, which can be crucial in wooing the support of millions of Muslims in Indonesia.
Amir, is it the same in Malaysia?
Yes, I think for Malaysia is largely the same. Many impressionable youths follow some of these preachers online and during lecture circuits across the country. And political parties give them a platform on their party channels, online broadcasts. And I think looking ahead, in Malaysia, Islamic preachers could play an even bigger role in key elections. And even in government, they themselves could one day contest in elections. And this direct participation of preachers and the mix of religion and politics is set to continue in Malaysia both at a local district level and even one day in federal politics.
I want to continue by asking you about what the Islamist party PAS is doing, doubling down on Sharia law in places they control, like Kelantan in Terengganu. What's convinced leaders, to do this right now? Is there a significant change in the overall mood that they decided, okay, this is a good time, a good opportunity for us to double down on what we believe we should be standing for?
So Sharia here is Islamic law based on moral and legal guidance. It not only encompasses criminal punishments, it's also about marriage, inheritance, and financial issues. And PAS thinks that implementing Sharia law in Malaysia has always been a big part of its objective since the party was formed. But now there's a difference between, pushing for Sharia and Shariatization, which is the politicization of this debate. So PAS wants to strengthen its Malay Muslim base in the north, and they see themselves as championing Sharia by defending the sanctity of Islam in their eyes. They are strengthening the support among their key group of Malay Muslim, which encompasses about more than 60% of the Malaysian population. But scholars have long debated the application of the Sharia laws to a modern-day multi-religious, multi-racial society. But PAS sees it as doubling down on its hardline brand of political Islam, and they see it as one formula to get them success at the next election.
And what's been the impact on non-Muslims in these places?
Well, Sharia shouldn't apply to non-Muslims. It is a law that only should apply to Muslims. But in the northern states, we are seeing some of these laws being enacted, such as a ban on gambling, gender segregation in cinemas and public swimming pools. And non-Muslims may not necessarily believe in these laws, but they are forced to comply. And also because of PAS's dominance in the north, they control the state government in Terengganu. In the state government in Terengganu, there's no representation from ethnic minorities. And some minorities can't help but feel that their concerns are not addressed. So we spoke to Mr. Wong Fok Sik in Terengganu, who is a retiree, and this is what he had to say.
Sometimes the state government forgets we also have problems. If there's a Chinese representative, we can sit down together to talk about issues like what the Chinese community wants, how to spruce up Chinatown, and loosen the rules which we feel can be too strict for us.
So minorities like Mr. Wong can't help but feel that their issues are not addressed, and they are hopeful for more minority representation in the Terengganu government in the future.
Okay. Neville, do you observe the same thing happening in Indonesian states? Or are there, differences because of Indonesia's Pancasila, for example? Although I'm hearing things about compulsory hijab wearing. You two put together a short program about this happening, non-Muslims having to wear the hijab. Tell us what it's like.
Basically the same, although there are differences. In Indonesia, these policies are sometimes initiated by bureaucrats who are not affiliated to Islamic Party. So both the Islamic Party politicians and Nationalist Party politicians feel the need to pander to the desires and demands of these conservative Islamist groups because of how influential they have become in our society. But the impacts on non-Muslims are the same. In several places across Indonesia, like you mentioned, all female students are required to wear the hijab regardless of their religion. So many non-Muslims in Indonesia are forced to wear the hijab, take Islamic studies classes, learn how to read Arabic, even in public schools. And unfortunately, in fairly homogeneous cities, towns, and villages, non-Muslims are underrepresented or perhaps unrepresented in local parliament or city council. So they have no choice but to suffer in silence or move to another city.
I am wondering, do you expect this religious politicization of Islam to carry on, to continue in Indonesia, Neville?
I think it will continue, and there is no sign that suggests otherwise. Sharia-inspired regulations continue to be formulated and enacted in cities and provinces across Indonesia. And in some cases, there are national law which are inspired by the Sharia. So I think as long as politicians continue to see the benefit of pandering to the demands of conservative groups and individuals, this issue will not go away.
Amir?
Well, in Malaysia, it's also similar. I think we're seeing these issues dominate headlines every week. It was socks with the word Allah, doormats with the word Allah. banning of concerts, and political parties like PAS will always play up religious sentiments. And the current government wants to focus on the economy, wants to help the people cope with the cost of living, helping Malaysians. But the reality is that it is constantly distracted by racial and religious issues. So it's very difficult for Prime Minister Anwar to govern. Religion and politics has always been intertwined in Malaysia, and I think moving forward to the next elections is set to continue. We spoke to Professor James Chin, a political analyst. This is what he had to say.
For the older one, they've accepted the fact that they are a minority and they're willing to live with the restrictions as long as they're allowed to practice their faith and their festivals behind closed doors. So they're quite willing to live the restrictions. But for the younger one, what is very clear to me is that they're not willing to live with increasing restrictions. So that's the reason why if you speak to the Chinese or the minority communities like the Thai communities, they will tell you that most of the children have left the state. They've moved to the Klang Valley. A lot of them claim it's economic opportunities, but I suspect part of it is economic, but a bigger part of it is actually the social restrictions and the fear that things will actually get worse for the non-Muslim community.
Well, Amir and Nivel, thank you both very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Arnold.
As always, you can catch reports from all our correspondents on CNA's YouTube channel and CNA.Asia. And a reminder that the TV episodes of CNA Correspondent air every Wednesday at 9:30 p.m. The team behind this week's edition is Sai Ye Win, Kor Kian Beng, Clara Ong, Crispina Robert, Craig Dale, and myself, Arnold Gay. Thank you for joining us.